Chapter 3 November 1st, 1978. Molly was still up when Mulcahy returned home from the crime scene in the wee hours of the next morning. She might have dozed off a couple of times in the easy chair under the lamp where she did her knitting, but she sprang up to meet her husband at the door, and she assisted as he hung his hat and shook off his overcoat. Molly reached for his coat and slid it down his arms from behind. When her husband turned around, she could see the weight of the case, along with the fatigue, etched into his features. He gave her a smile anyway. "You didn't have to wait up," Mulcahy said after kissing her on the lips. "Nonsense," Molly dismissed him. "I got stew simmering on the stove. How about a bowl to cut the autumn chill?" "It's not the weather that chilled my blood, I can tell you that," Mulcahy said. He never discussed the sordid details of his cases with Molly, but his general comments never failed to trigger his wife's relentlessly optimistic reassurance. He needed this now more than ever. "There was a bit about it on the late news," Molly said, shaking her head. "Terrible. Just terrible. Makes you wonder what the world's coming to now, doesn't it? But I know you, Finbarr. I know you'll work till you get to the bottom of it and do justice for that poor girl. You always do. But right now, you need to let your mind rest." Molly jerked her head toward the kitchen. "Come for some stew. It'll help you rest, so you're fresh in the morn." Molly took her husband's hand and led him to the kitchen. The comforting aroma of the stew intensified as they left the foyer and crossed the living room. For Mulcahy, those 15 or 20 steps were like crossing the Rubicon. His home and Molly's love were safe behind some invisible line that divided the wicked world of murder, where he toiled in filth and depravity. On the other side was a safe zone of hand-sewn quilts, homemade meals, and old country traditions that Molly kept for him. It was home. And each time Mulcahy crossed the modest threshold that might as well have been a yawning moat for its ability to protect him from evil, he was so grateful for it. Grateful for her. His Moll. Yes, Mulcahy thought, as they entered the kitchen and he saw the simmering pot of chunk beef, sliced carrots, potato quarters, and savory broth. This is exactly what I need. Molly reached for the bowls and spoons set out on the counter, but her husband's heart was already warm, full of love and appreciation for the wonderful home she kept for him. He snugged up behind his wife, wrapping his arms around her waist as Molly ladled stew into a bowl. "You're right, Moll," he whispered, his mouth by her ear. "By God, you're always right." "And don't you forget it," she said, smiling. "Now mind yourself, Finbarr. I promise to warm you up with some stew. For other things, you'll have to earn it." She turned to him with the bowl, looking sheepish but sexy. "Yes, ma'am," he said, taking the steaming concoction into his hands, then raising it to his nose. It smelled like home. It smelled like love. Mulcahy returned to Arbor Street early the next morning. It was the kind of crystal-clear, refreshingly crisp November day that could fool one into thinking winter was still many months distant. For a murder cop working a fresh homicide, it made for a fine day for grim work, knocking on doors and pounding the pavement where Alicia Franklin had spent her last hours. With Flores fixated on the father, Mulcahy knew he'd have to come up with something to change the trajectory of the case. But interview after front porch interview was coming up snake eyes. It proved a long, laborious morning of housewives in hair curlers and frightened widows in housecoats. all shaking their heads and tisk-tisking over what a tragedy it all was, but offering little in the way of actual information. Yes, they had seen Alicia dressed in her grease outfit, holding out her candy bag for the Halloween night offerings. No, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the usual trick-or-treaters out making their rounds. Neighborhood kids dressed as robots, villains, and swashbucklers from that space movie, Star Wars. Despite insisting that it was none of their business, everyone seemed to know all about the marital troubles the Franklins had been having. They'd heard the knockdown, drag-out fights. They'd witnessed Mr. Franklin stumbling home late from the bars. They'd spied upon Mrs. Franklin dressed to the nines just to go out shopping. But no, they had never seen the old man take an angry hand to his daughter, nor had they heard him utter a cross word in little Alicia's direction. In short, Mulcahy was getting nowhere fast. But that was the thing about the young, book-learned detective. He was absolutely relentless. He'd cover the entire block because one never knew when the story would change and the case would turn. And Mulcahy knew, absolutely believed, it wasn't assumptions, hunches, or feelings that closed cases and captured killers. It was details. Hard-won, accurate, and unassailable facts. And he meant to find them. Mulcahy systematically worked a grid pattern, up one side of the street and down the other. He was en route to the next house, the soles of his shoes playing a gritty soft shoe on the concrete sidewalk, when he spotted the dark, unmarked detective's car taking a wide turn onto the street. Sal Flores' beefy forearm hung from the rolled-down driver's side window as he navigated the behemoth Ford down the center of the quiet, tree-lined street. As the car neared Mulcahy, the senior detective leaned his fleshy face out the car window and grinned like a Halloween jack-o'-lantern at the pathetically predictable junior investigator. Flores wore the look of satisfaction for having predicted precisely where he'd find his by-the-book rival. As the car floated by, Flores steered with one hand, a sausage-sized cigar clamped between two fat fingers hovering over the wheel. He swerved toward the berm and rolled up on Mulcahy. Flores plugged the cigar into his mouth and sucked on it, the ashen tip flaring orange. He clenched it between his teeth, allowing smoke to waft from his mouth just as the car lurched to a stop amid a discordant symphony of squeaking brakes. "Anything?" Flores croaked through his clenched teeth. Mulcahy approached the car and leaned in. He nodded to Jack Nesto, Flores' ever-present sidekick, in the passenger seat. As was his officious habit, Mulcahy then pulled the skinny reporter's notebook from his back pocket and leafed through its pages before answering. It was as if the key to the case lay somewhere in his nearly illegible scratchings. Flores frowned impatiently from the open car window. "I'm developing a list of everyone who was in the neighborhood last night," Mulcahy finally answered, "and I'm reconstructing the victim's movements based on the approximate time she visited each house for trick-or-treat. It's a little early to draw conclusions." Mulcahy glanced up from his notes. "Yeah, whatever," an uninterested Flores bellowed, along with a cloud of cigar smoke that drifted into Mulcahy's face. "Why don't you come back to the office, and I'll brief you on a couple of developments." Flores jerked his head for Mulcahy to get inside the car. Mulcahy glanced at Nesto. Flores' deputy lapdog, gopher, and ass-kisser shot Mulcahy a shit-eating grin. College boy would have to take a back seat. It was where the perps rode, and it was another way Flores and his allies would show Mulcahy his place. Mulcahy opened the heavy rear door, climbed in, and then pulled it shut with the force of a hatch closing on a tank. "So, what do you have?" the Irishman asked. trying to make eye contact through the car's rearview mirror. Flores' eyes lifted into the mirror, studying the competition. Cigar smoke wafted up, shrouding his narrowed, disembodied stare. It was as if Flores was weighing both the threats and the advantages of involving Mulcahy in the case. The senior detective pondered the question with another pull on the fat stogie, then brought a meaty hand to his mouth and withdrew it. "Turns out this ain't gonna be a slam dunk it appeared last night," Flores began, steering the car back onto the street at a low, leisurely speed. Flores stuck his arm out the car window and tapped ashes from the smoldering butt. As Mulcahy watched, he wondered whether this was a metaphor for the case. Was it going up in smoke? "The father wouldn't confess." Mulcahy offered this as a statement, not a question. Indeed, it was a development he'd all but predicted last night. Flores grunted, his massive shoulders rising and falling. "By 4 a.m. this morning, I'd have sworn he'd sign his own death warrant, the way we sweated him." Nesto turned and nodded eagerly, as if to confirm the egregious illegalities of the interrogation, which nevertheless had yielded no fruit. "Hell," Flores huffed. "I still don't like the smell of him. Not the way he just sat in that shithole of a house, feeding his rage with beer and bile. But it turns out we encountered a complication with the medical exam." "She couldn't have been raped," Mulcahy blurted. Again, it wasn't a question. It was an emphatic statement of fact, as if the college-educated investigator had long ago ruled this out. Flores' eyes darted to the rearview mirror. "No," he confirmed. "No rape, no sexual assault of any kind. Something else." "A signature," said Mulcahy, his eyes widening. "A what?" Nesto asked, bewildered. "You saying criminals sign their work these days?" Nesto grunted incredulity at the absurdity of such a statement. But Flores didn't join in the mocking. Instead, his eyes studied Mulcahy through the rearview mirror. The younger detective had anticipated something he had not. "The killer left us something," Mulcahy added eagerly. "A calling card." Nesto smirked, still trying to stoke Flores' derision. Instead, the lead investigator frowned and dropped his eyes. It was an act of surrender by a proud detective. Mulcahy's agile mind, which was leaping from conclusion to conclusion without the benefit of any of the reports, was making Flores tired. "I don't know nothing about a calling card," Flores finally grunted. "But there was a mark. With all the blood, there was no way to see it at the scene. But after they washed her up, there it was, on the meat of her right forearm. Some kind of weird bite mark." "Weird how?" Mulcahy pressed, fully engaged now, leaning forward from the back seat. "It's only half there." Flores shrugged his shoulders in frustration. The gesture, along with the confused scowl on his broad face, was involuntary. Flores didn't want Mulcahy to know how exasperated he was. But the volatile Italian didn't possess much in the way of impulse control. He didn't know how to play it close to the vest. Reading him was easy. Most times this was an advantage. The clearer suspects could see Flores' rage, the better. But he wasn't used to matching wits with brainiac college cops. "How's that possible?" Mulcahy marveled. "By definition, a bite mark is comprised of the upper and lower teeth. In fact, pressure from the movable lower jaw is what creates the biting force." Flores raised a hand to the top of his head, extending a finger to scratch the crown of his scalp. It was yet another tell. "Looks like your scientific definition never met our shit sandwich of a case," Flores said. "Show him the picture." Nesto opened a manila file and plucked out an 8x10 glossy. He passed it to Mulcahy, who stared at the image. Sure enough, a half-moon of teeth from someone's upper jaw was welted into Alicia Franklin's milky white skin. But there was nothing below the mark. No corresponding half-moon from the lower jaw was evident in the pristine skin. Silence lingered for what seemed like minutes. Then Mulcahy spoke. "This is it," he said, his eyes rising from the picture and shifting between Flores and Nesto, gauging to see if they realized the import of this key piece of evidence. "This, right here." Mulcahy poked the evidence photo with his finger. His voice had changed from initial astonishment at his realization to genuine excitement for all its implications. "Don't you see?" he pressed. "The mark. That's the case. We find what, who and how this mark was made, and we have the killer." Flores turned as far as his bulk would allow. "Easier said than done," he grunted. As he returned his eyes to the road, Flores noticed a beat-up panel van parked around a corner. The van's swinging side door was flung open, and a mop-topped, bell-bottom-clad hippie weirdo was loading it with something. With Pittsburgh's drug culture in high gear, this was suspicious in itself. But this scene went one better. This kid was handling weapons, in broad daylight no less. The sharp blades of machetes and the jagged edges of knives were all but gleaming in the bright November sun. Flores's mouth fell open in disbelief, and his mind made an immediate, inevitable connection the moment he spotted the glare from the shiny edge of the hunting knife the hippie was holding. It was the same kind of blade that had almost taken off Alicia Franklin's head the night before, and just a block or so away. The conclusion was right there in the coroner's preliminary report. Flores flicked the cigar butt out the car window and floored the gas pedal. A rush of adrenaline and a surge of rage, always rage, coursed through him. The lumbering car loomed toward the van, and all Sal Flores could think was, maybe this case wouldn't be a ball-buster after all. Flores slapped the magnetic cherry top onto the car's roof. He gunned the engine, then slammed the brakes. The unmarked car screeched to a halt at a slanted angle, blocking the van. Flores jammed the transmission into park and flung open the car door. He lunged out like a linebacker and grabbed for the butt of his service revolver, which rode in a holster under his sport coat. He withdrew the gun and leveled the weapon as he walked with authority toward the unsuspecting man. Joey Hartigan was leaning inside the van's open side door when Detective Sal Flores pressed the cold, hard barrel of a gun to his head. "Move so much as a muscle and I redecorate this vehicle with your brains," Flores huffed, as Nesto trotted up behind. Hartigan froze, a machete in one hand and another of those jagged-edged hunting knives in the other. "Drop it," Flores commanded. "Right now." Hartigan did so, without any hesitation. But there was something off about the sound the weapons made when they fell to the van's floor. Yet neither Flores nor Nesto processed this fact. Flores was too busy poking the nose of his revolver into the back of Hartigan's neck as his free hand pawed the kid's body to frisk him. By now, Mulcahy had reached the van, his mind still processing all he was seeing. "Why don't you raise your hands and turn around real slow-like," Flores said in a low voice, almost daring the suspect to defy him. Then the old-school detective would have all the license he needed to put the case to bed with one pull of his revolver's trigger. Looking back on it many times over many years, Mulcahy would often think that Flores should have just shot Hartigan point blank. The form of justice the poor kid later received had all the weight and legitimacy of process and procedure, but in the end, it was just as arbitrary. And wrong. Dead wrong. "Wait, Sal," Mulcahy managed, his hungry eyes processing the scene. "Take it easy, huh?" But Flores only bored his gun barrel deeper into Hartigan's neck. This caused the scruffy kid, clad in a jean jacket and bell-bottoms, to jerk. He turned his neck, both to relieve the pain and to see who was accosting him. "Easy, I said," Flores boomed, then cocked the revolver. The signature sound of the hammer being pulled back into firing position caused Hartigan to seize. Every single muscle in his body stiffened, freezing his form into that of a statue. The only thing that moved then were the long, tangled, and greasy curls dancing atop his head in the November wind. "Don't do this, detective," Mulcahy warned. Flores's huge shoulders rose and fell as he grunted his scorn. He jerked his huge head. "What'd I tell you, Nesto?" Flores's voice dripped with derision. "Joe College is fine in a library, but put him on the street, and he gets all squishy and shit." Nesto forced out a sound that was intended to signal agreement, his full and complete backing of his partner. But the tension constricting Nesto's throat made it come out weak and pathetic. Flores had to know he was on his own. His ways, the old ways, were dying and drowning as surely as a dinosaur in a tar pit. "Hands high," Flores shouted. "Then turn around. Slow. No surprises now." Hartigan did as instructed. Yet as he pirouetted to face the detectives, the hippie kid wore a sly grin on his otherwise handsome face. And he didn't seem nervous. Either the kid was a primo poker player holding better cards, or he was bluffing. "Okay," Joey Hartigan announced. "You got me." Nesto looked nervously to Flores, as if in search of some kind of explanation. Flores's own confused expression made clear he didn't have one. Surely it wasn't this easy to sweat a confession. Usually it took a few whacks upside the head with the Pittsburgh Yellow Pages. The phone book was a fantastic confession room tool. It didn't leave any marks. "What do you mean?" Flores muttered suspiciously, narrowing his small, porcine eyes at Hartigan. The kid was still looking too damn cool. Too cool by a mile. "Guess you're gonna take me downtown now," Hartigan said, almost tauntingly, as if he was not only fine with this, but actually welcomed the development. How did one go from being scared stiff by a gun pressed to the base of one's skull to becoming totally relaxed? The transformation seemed to occur when Hartigan realized his assailants were cops. Somehow this fact comforted him, rather than accelerated his anxiety. But why? Mulcahy was beginning to think he knew the answer. Flores, however, remained dumbfounded by the development. For the first time in Mulcahy's memory, the great Italian investigator looked stumped. His huge, protruding forehead twisted into a tangled knot of frustration over narrowed, unknowing eyes. "Now why would we go and do that?" Flores ventured, not sure what he was dealing with. Hartigan shrugged, a gesture so unguarded and easy it was clear that his casualness wasn't an act. In that moment, Mulcahy was all but positive that what he was witnessing wasn't the false bravado of a guilty man. No, this kind of calm had only one source: innocence. If only Mulcahy could have kept the courage of his convictions. If only he could have remained as confident and clear-eyed as his suspect on that fateful first day. "I'll play it however you like," Hartigan said, losing none of his easy, defenseless demeanor, despite a gun still leveled at him and an Italian detective rapidly losing what little was left of his tenuous temper. "Why don't you tell us about the weapons you got there?" Flores said, gesturing with the revolver toward the panel van behind Hartigan. Hartigan dipped his chin in acknowledgement. Hands still raised in acquiescence to Flores, he turned his head slightly and cast an eye toward the van. The side doors were open, but the van's interior was cast in shadow, obscuring its contents. "Sure are a lot of 'em, huh?" Hartigan said, turning back to Flores. "They look mighty dangerous, too, if I don't say so myself. Lots of killing to be done, I'd say." The towering detective couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never encountered a suspect quite like this. The continued confusion screwed his face into a scowl that begged but one question. What in the living hell was this sicko up to? "I guess you won't mind if we took a look for ourselves," Flores said, once again gesturing toward the van with the pointed revolver. Hartigan crinkled his nose, an exaggerated show of confusion. "Overly exaggerated," Mulcahy observed. "As if this kid was acting." "Don't you need a warrant?" Hartigan posed quizzically, then lowered a hand to scratch the top of his head. Once again, these were the mannerisms of an actor. A bad one at that. But the kid was on some kind of a roll, so he kept at it. By now, he was shaking his head and clucking his tongue in mock disappointment. "Dang!" Hartigan exclaimed. "And you guys were doing so well, too. But the first thing real cops do is read you your rights. I'd say you three got some rehearsing to do. But the casting and the costumes." Hartigan paused and nodded his approval. "Impeccable. Absolutely spot on. Especially you, big guy." The kid jerked his head toward an utterly confused Sal Flores, who understood nothing, until Hartigan took his act one step too far. "I just hope the audience doesn't find you too much of a cliché," Hartigan continued, glaring at Flores with a critical eye. "You know, the quintessential ethnic bad cop stereotype." And then Joey Hartigan began to lower his arms. The crimson-faced Flores was a blur of fierce and efficient motion. He palmed the revolver and took the butt across Hartigan's face, splitting the kid's lips against his teeth. Stunned, Hartigan's legs crumbled beneath him. Flores grabbed the collapsing kid's wrist, spun him around like a rag doll, and wrenched his forearm high up on his back. He had total control in a matter of seconds. It was a textbook street maneuver. Even Mulcahy would have to give Flores that. But it was totally unnecessary. "I've had just about enough of you," a huffing Flores seethed into Hartigan's ear. "We ask you simple questions, and you give us nothing but attitude. Maybe it is time we take this downtown." Events had occurred so quickly, Hartigan remained disoriented. He grimaced against the pain of his wrenched arm. A free hand clung to his face, blood seeping between his fingers. "You fucking broke my nose!" a shocked Hartigan managed in a muted voice that sounded both nasal and astonished. Flores's flushed face broke into a wide grin. Finally, a reaction he was accustomed to. Back on familiar footing, he turned to Nesto. "Guess we finally got this guy's attention," Flores said, then gave Hartigan's twisted forearm another crank. "Cuff this asshole, will you?" Nesto holstered his revolver, brandished the shiny steel bracelets, and then stepped forward. "Against the van," Nesto said, with as much authority as he could muster. But his voice still sounded thin. He coughed, then added, "Now." With a mere turn of the suspect's wrist, Flores guided Hartigan to the van. Nesto cinched the cuffs on the suspect's wrists, then roamed his hands over Hartigan's body, only to find him clean. Meanwhile, Flores moved toward the open van doors to inspect its contents. "Jesus Christ!" he mumbled, in awe at the vast collection of weapons. Mulcahy stepped forward and saw it too. Rows of knives, machetes, nightsticks, all arrayed on the blanket-covered van floor. There were also cardboard boxes, and 2 or 3 carry caddies that TV repairmen or ambulance technicians might use. "You want to explain this?" Flores said, with a tone of command.